My name is Rachel Owens. I'm 35 years old. I work as an intensive care nurse at a hospital in Denver, Colorado, and on a Tuesday evening in March, sitting in a small consultation room down the hall from my brother's hospital bed, my mother took both of my hands across the table and said, "You're the only one who can save him, Rachel. You've always been the strong one. This is what you were built for." The room was small, fluorescent lit, the kind of space hospitals use for exactly these conversations, with a box of tissues centered on the table like a piece of standard equipment nobody wanted to acknowledge as necessary. I looked at the folder in front of me, the transplant compatibility results, the surgical consent forms, a pen already uncapped and waiting, and I didn't say yes and I didn't say no. I said I needed a week. My mother's face did something I'd seen before. A specific tightening around the eyes that I'd learned over 35 years meant disappointment dressed up as patience. What she didn't know, sitting across that table so certain of what I owed my brother, was that 2 days earlier, going through Tyler's discharge paperwork as part of my own job, I had already found the first piece of something that was going to change everything about what saving him actually meant. If you're watching this, welcome back, and if this is your first time here, thank you for stopping by. I want to tell you what 35 years of being the reliable one in my family actually cost, and what I found out in the week I asked for before I made the biggest decision of my life. Comment the word "survive" if you've ever been told your body, your time, or your money was simply what you were built for, and stay with me, because what I found in that week wasn't the confirmation my parents expected me to walk in with. It was something that would have put both my brother and me at real, unnecessary risk if I hadn't looked closely enough to find it in time. Let me take you back to where this actually started, because that consultation room wasn't the beginning. It was the end of 35 years of something I didn't have language for until very recently. I was born in 1990 in Grand Junction, Colorado, the first child of Carol and Frank Owens. My brother Tyler was born 4 years later in 1994, 3 weeks premature, spending his first 11 days in a neonatal intensive care unit at St. Mary's Hospital. I've heard the story of those 11 days more times than I can count, told at nearly every family gathering of my childhood, always ending the same way, with my mother's hand pressed to her chest. We almost lost him. We promised God we'd never let anything happen to that boy again. I don't think my parents ever said it out loud as a rule, but I understood from somewhere around the age of 6 that Tyler's early fragility had become the permanent lens through which our entire family saw him, long after any actual fragility had passed. I want to give you 3 specific memories from my childhood, because I think they explain the whole dynamic better than any summary could. The first happened when I was 9 in 1999 and Tyler was 5. I broke my wrist falling off the monkey bars at recess, a clean fracture that required a cast for 6 weeks. My mother picked me up from the school nurse's office, signed the paperwork, and drove me to urgent care without once, that I can remember, asking how much it hurt. That same week, Tyler had a mild ear infection, and I remember my mother staying home from her own job for 2 full days to watch him on the couch, bringing him soup, calling my grandmother twice a day with updates. I don't say this to suggest a broken wrist and an ear infection carry equal medical weight. I say it because even at 9 years old, lying in bed with my arm throbbing under a fresh cast, I understood something about the relative currency of our 2 bodies in that house, and I didn't yet have any language to object to it. The second memory happened when I was 14 in 2004, the year I made the varsity swim team as a freshman, a fairly unusual accomplishment at my high school. My parents came to exactly one meet that entire season, the regional qualifier, and left at halftime because Tyler, 10 years old at the time, had called saying he felt sick and wanted to come home from a friend's house. I swam my best race of the year 20 minutes after they left, qualifying for state, and told them about it that night at dinner. My father said, "That's great, honey," without looking up from his plate, then spent the next 15 minutes discussing whether Tyler's stomachache might be something serious enough to see a doctor about. It wasn't. It never was in any of the dozens of similar moments across those years. But the pattern of attention itself never once wavered. The third memory, and maybe the one that set the clearest tone for what came later, happened when I was 17 in 2007 and Tyler was 13. I'd been accepted into a summer pre-nursing program at the University of Colorado that cost $600, money I'd have to earn myself working weekends at a grocery store, since my parents told me plainly that money was tight that year. That same summer, Tyler wanted a new gaming console, roughly $400, and received it within a week of asking, no discussion of tightness at all. When I asked my mother carefully why the money situation seemed different depending on which of us was asking, she said, "Rachel, you're capable of earning your own way. Tyler needs a little more support right now, he's still finding his footing." I was 17. I didn't yet understand that "capable of earning your own way" would become the exact sentence used to justify every future imbalance between us for the next 18 years. I want to add a fourth memory here too, because it explains something about the broader emotional climate of that house that made all of this easier to accept for far longer than it should have been. My mother kept a small shelf in the living room, visible from the front door, with framed photographs update every year or two, school portraits, sports trophies, milestone moments. For most of my childhood, that shelf held roughly twice as many photographs of Tyler as of me, not because I achieved less by any measurable standard, but because, as my mother explained once when I asked, half joking, why there wasn't a photo of my own state swim qualification on it, "Tyler's moments feel more important to capture, sweetheart. You've always been steady enough that we don't worry about missing anything with you." I understood even at 14 that being steady enough not to worry about was, in that house, a kind of quiet erasure dressed up as a compliment, and I began, without ever fully deciding to, keeping my own achievements a little more private after that, since sharing them rarely seemed to change what made it onto the shelf. My childhood best friend, a woman named Alina Ruiz who I've stayed close with through every stage of my life since, told me once in our late 20s over drinks something that startled me at the time. She said, "Rachel, I used to come over to your house in middle school and feel so weird about how differently your mom talked to you versus Tyler. I never said anything because I figured it wasn't my place, but I remember it clearly even now." I asked her what specifically she remembered. She said she'd asked Tyler what he wanted for dinner like it was the most important question in the world, and she'd just tell you what you were having. I don't think I ever once heard her ask you what you wanted. I sat with that memory for a long time after Alina told me about it, because it was such a small, ordinary-sounding detail, and yet it captured more precisely than almost anything else anyone has ever said to me exactly how early and how thoroughly the pattern had been built into the ordinary texture of our daily life, long before either of us had any of the language we have now to describe it. I want to give you one more piece of family history here, because it matters for understanding who I eventually leaned on outside my parents and Marcus. My maternal grandmother, Dorothy, lived 2 hours away in Pueblo for most of my childhood and adolescence, and she was, in her own quiet way, the one relative who consistently noticed the imbalance in our house without ever making a spectacle of noticing it. She used to send me cards for no occasion at all, just "thinking of you, Rachel, proud of the person you're becoming," small gestures that meant more to me than I think she ever fully realized. She died in 2015 when I was 25, and one of the last real conversations we had a few months before she passed, she said to me, holding my hand at her kitchen table, "Your mother loves you both the same, Rachel, I truly believe that. But loving 2 children the same and treating them the same were never the same thing, and somebody in this family needs to say that out loud eventually because nobody else seems willing to." I didn't fully understand what she meant at 25. I understand it completely now, 10 years later, sitting with everything that happened this spring. Here's the number I want you to remember, because it comes back later and it matters more than anything else I'm about to tell you. Between 2012, when I graduated nursing school, and the spring of this year, I calculated, going back through my own bank records during the week I asked my parents for, that I had given my brother and my parents, combined, $91,400 in direct financial support, rent covered during 3 different periods of unemployment, 2 stints in outpatient treatment programs, a DUI legal fee in 2019, and a used car in 2021 after his third one was repossessed. In that same window, I received from my parents exactly one meaningful financial gift, $800 toward my own wedding in 2018, a wedding my mother spent most of the reception describing to my new mother-in-law as smaller than we'd hoped to give her, but Tyler's needs come first this year, you understand. So when my mother sat across that consultation room table and told me I was the strong one, built for exactly this moment, I had to sit with my hands very still in my lap, because I had just spent 13 years quietly watching what strength actually meant in that family, not a compliment but a designation, the label assigned to whichever child's needs could be indefinitely postponed. Now let me walk you through how this built year by year, because that hospital consultation room wasn't the beginning. It was the end of a pattern that had been running quietly since before I even had the vocabulary to name it. The first real incident I can point to as a young adult rather than a child happened in 2012, the year I graduated nursing school at 22. Tyler, 18 at the time, was arrested for underage possession at a house party, his first real legal trouble. My parents hired an attorney within 24 hours, spending roughly $3,000 to have the charges reduced to a diversion program with no lasting record. I remember my father on the phone with that attorney using a tone of urgency I'd never once heard him use about anything involving me, saying, "Whatever it takes, we are not letting this follow him." That same month, I was struggling to afford my own nursing board exam fees, roughly $300, and asked my parents tentatively whether they might help. My father said, "You're about to have a real paycheck, Rachel, you'll be fine," and I paid it myself on a credit card, the balance of which I carried for the following 8 months. I remember rationalizing this to myself very specifically. Tyler's situation was urgent, a legal emergency, while mine was just a bill I could handle myself given enough time. I didn't yet understand that urgent in my family had quietly become a permanent status assigned to one specific person, regardless of what was actually happening. The second incident in 2014 involved Tyler's first attempt at college, at a state school 2 hours from home. He lasted 3 semesters before withdrawing, citing not the right fit, having accumulated by the time he left roughly $11,000 in tuition my parents had paid outright, no loans involved. That same year, I was accepted into a competitive ICU residency program that required an unpaid 6-week training period before the paid position began. I asked my parents whether I could stay in my old childhood bedroom for those 6 weeks to save on rent while I completed it, and my mother told me apologetically that Tyler had just moved back home after withdrawing from school and needed the space to get back on his feet without added stress. I remember standing in the kitchen of that house. The same house I'd grown up in, being told there wasn't room for me in it anymore, while my brother's old bedroom, unused for 3 semesters, sat exactly as he'd left it. I found a couch to sleep on with a coworker instead. I remember feeling that year the first real flicker of something sharper than confusion, not quite anger yet, but close to it, quickly smoothed over by my own internal reminder that Tyler was still young, still finding his way, and that comparing our two situations directly wasn't fair to either of us. I want to give you a warmth beat here, because this period wasn't only difficult, and I don't want to paint it that way. That same year, I met my future husband, Marcus, a paramedic I'd started working alongside on joint emergency calls, and he was, from our very first real conversation, the one person who consistently asked me how something had affected me specifically, rather than simply how the broader family situation was unfolding. I remember telling him on our third date the story about the summer nursing program and the gaming console, expecting him to shrug it off the way I'd trained myself to. Instead, he said quietly, "That's not a small thing, Rachel. I don't think you should treat it like one." It was the first time anyone outside my own head had named the pattern instead of asking me to be reasonable about it. I also want to mention my first charge nurse, a woman named Gail Thornton, who supervised my earliest years in the ICU starting in 2014, and who, without ever knowing the full shape of my family history, taught me something I didn't fully understand the significance of until much later. Gail used to say, reviewing a new nurse's first few shifts, "The patient who never complains isn't the patient who's doing fine. They're often the patient you need to check on most carefully because they've learned complaining doesn't change anything." She meant it clinically, about pain management and post-operative recovery. I've thought about that sentence, though, more times than I can count in relation to my own life outside that hospital, understanding slowly that I had spent my entire childhood becoming exactly the kind of patient Gail warned her nurses about: quiet, uncomplaining, and, as a direct result, chronically undertreated by the people who were supposed to be checking on me most closely. The third incident happened in 2016, and this is where the financial stakes started becoming significantly larger. Tyler, 22 by then, was arrested for his second DUI, this one involving a minor collision with no serious injuries. My parents paid $18,000 combined for legal representation, court fees, and a 30-day inpatient treatment program at a private facility outside Boulder. I remember sitting with my mother in the hospital waiting room the night of the accident. Tyler had been brought in briefly for evaluation, and hearing her say to my father in a hushed voice she probably assumed I couldn't hear from 3 seats away, "We cannot lose him, Frank. Whatever it costs." I understood, hearing that sentence on some level I didn't yet have words for, that the same intensity of protective love that had once kept my mother home from work over an ear infection had, over 17 years, calcified into an almost automatic willingness to absorb any cost, financial or otherwise, on Tyler's behalf, with no equivalent instinct ever extended toward me. I remember, too, sitting in that same waiting room in my scrubs, having come directly from a 12-hour shift of my own, and nobody in that room, not even briefly, asking how my own night had gone before pivoting entirely to Tyler's. The fourth incident, in 2017, is when I first noticed the language shifting in a way that would come to matter enormously later. At a family dinner that spring, my father, discussing Tyler's second stint in outpatient treatment, said, "Rachel, you're the one with the medical background. You should really be keeping an eye on his recovery for us. You'd catch things we might miss." I remember feeling, at the time, a strange mixture of validation and unease. Validation that my professional expertise was finally being acknowledged as valuable, unease at a request I couldn't quite name the shape of yet. I started that year quietly monitoring Tyler's recovery in an informal capacity, reviewing his medication lists when he'd let me, asking careful questions about his sobriety that he mostly answered honestly, at least in those early years. I remember thinking at the time that this new role finally gave me something concrete and valued to contribute, a specific place in the family's crisis machinery that felt, for the first time, like genuine usefulness rather than quiet invisibility. It would take me years to understand that being folded into the machinery wasn't the same thing as finally being seen by it. Marcus proposed to me that same year in October of 2017, on a hiking trail outside Boulder we'd been going to since our first year of dating. And I remember standing there with the ring in front of me, feeling something I hadn't fully expected, not just joy but a specific kind of relief, the sense that whatever else was true about my family, I was building a second one from scratch with someone who had never once treated my steadiness as an excuse to look away. I told Gail, my charge nurse, about the engagement the following Monday, and she hugged me, genuinely delighted, and said, "Good, you deserve someone who checks on the patient who never complains." I laughed at the callback to her old teaching line, not fully understanding that morning how directly it applied to my own life outside that hospital. If you've ever been the one whose competence got treated as a permanent, unpaid resource for someone else's crisis, I want you to comment, "Survive right now, because we are far from finished and what's coming next is worse before it gets better." The fifth incident in 2018 involved my own wedding, which I mentioned briefly a moment ago. Marcus and I paid for the vast majority of it ourselves, roughly $22,000 saved carefully over 2 years. My parents contributed $800, explaining that Tyler had just started a new landscaping venture that needed a little seed money to really get off the ground, roughly $6,000 given that same spring. I remember standing at my own reception in a dress I'd paid for myself, listening to my mother's toast, which spent nearly half its length discussing how proud she was of Tyler for finally finding his direction, before turning almost as an afterthought to wish Marcus and me well. I didn't say anything that night. I smiled, I danced, I told myself weddings make people sentimental and unfocused, that it didn't mean what it felt like it meant. Marcus, dancing with me later that evening, asked quietly whether I was okay, and I told him I was fine, the same automatic answer I'd been giving my entire life, though I remember he held on a little longer than the song required, as though he already suspected the answer wasn't quite true. The sixth incident in 2019 is when Tyler's landscaping venture folded, roughly 14 months after that seed money, having accumulated an additional $9,000 in operating losses my parents also absorbed. That same year, he was arrested for a third DUI, this one resulting in an actual license suspension and a mandatory longer treatment program, costing my parents an additional $26,000 for a 90-day residential facility. I remember my mother calling me that October not to ask how I was doing, but to ask whether I could come stay with him for the first 2 weeks after he gets out, just to help him settle back in. Since you understand the medical side of things better than any of us, I took 2 weeks of my own paid time off from the ICU to do exactly that, sleeping on Tyler's couch, managing his medication schedule, driving him to outpatient check-ins, while my own patients back at the hospital were covered by an already understaffed unit. I remember one night during that stretch, close to midnight, sitting on that couch charting his medication times on a legal pad because I didn't trust either of us to remember accurately, thinking distantly that I was essentially working a second unpaid shift on top of the one I'd just finished, except this one came with no relief nurse and no end time. Tyler thanked me genuinely, I think, at the end of those 2 weeks. My parents never once asked what it had cost me professionally to take that time. The seventh incident in 2020 involved a smaller moment that I think crystallized something important. During the early months of the pandemic, working full shifts in an overwhelmed ICU, watching patients die alone because visitors weren't allowed in the building, I asked my parents during one of our weekly calls whether they might check in on me a little more, given the stress of the job at that specific moment. My mother said, kindly enough on its surface, "Of course, honey, but you know how to handle pressure, that's always been your strength." Tyler's really struggling with the isolation. We've had to focus a lot of energy there. I remember hanging up that call and sitting in my car in the hospital parking garage for several minutes before going in for my shift, understanding with a clarity I hadn't quite had before that my own competence had become the exact mechanism by which my needs got quietly deprioritized every single time. I didn't call to ask again for the rest of that year. The eighth incident, in 2021, is when Tyler's third car was repossessed after several missed payments, and my parents, having already absorbed so much that year themselves due to my father's reduced hours during a company restructuring, asked me directly whether I could help cover a replacement vehicle, roughly $7,000 for a used sedan. I paid for it in full, telling myself it was a loan, though no formal agreement was ever written down and no payment was ever made against it in the 4 years since. I remember Marcus asking me gently that same week, "Rachel, when's the last time anyone in your family did something like this for you?" I didn't have an answer for him. I still don't, if I'm honest, beyond the $800 toward a wedding they'd already made clear was a lesser priority. I remember, too, driving that sedan to Tyler's apartment myself the day I bought it, handing him the keys in the parking lot and him hugging me tightly and saying, "You're the only one who's ever actually got my back, you know that." I remember how good that sentence felt to hear, and how uneasy I felt almost simultaneously at how much of my own sense of worth in that family seemed to depend on being the one who could be counted on to say yes. I want to add one more detail from that same year because it's small but it stayed with me. A few weeks after I bought that sedan, my own car, a 9-year-old hatchback with over 140,000 miles on it, needed nearly $1,500 in transmission repairs. I mentioned it once at a family dinner, half hoping someone might offer to help the way they so readily had for Tyler's car weeks earlier. My father said, "You've got a good job, Rachel, that's what savings are for," and the conversation moved on to something else within 30 seconds. I paid the repair myself, the same week I'd handed my brother a fully paid replacement vehicle, and I remember doing the math in my head that night almost involuntarily, the way I now do professionally with patient charts: 2 vehicles, 2 emergencies, 1 family, 2 entirely different sets of rules. The ninth incident in 2022 involved my own first pregnancy, which ended in a miscarriage at 11 weeks. I called my mother the day it happened, needing more than almost anything else in my adult life simply to be held. She was sympathetic on the phone, genuinely, I believe, for the length of that call, telling me she loved me, that she was so sorry, that she wished she could be there in person. 3 days later, she called back, not to check on me again, not to ask how I was sleeping or whether Marcus and I needed anything, but to ask whether I'd be available that weekend to help Tyler move apartments, since his new place needed to be ready before a court-mandated check-in with his probation officer. I said yes. I want to be honest that some part of me, even in the middle of my own grief, still reached automatically for the familiar shape of being needed, because it was, by then, the only shape of belonging in that family I fully trusted to be reliably available to me. I spent that Saturday carrying boxes up 2 flights of stairs, 4 days after a D&C procedure I hadn't fully recovered from, and told nobody in my family how much it physically hurt to do it. The 10th incident, in 2023, is when I first started keeping any kind of private record of what I'd given, though I didn't yet think of it as evidence. I thought of it honestly as something closer to grief processing, a way of making sense on paper of a pattern I could feel but couldn't yet fully see. I built a simple spreadsheet that spring dates down one column, amounts down the next, a final column for what, if anything, had been said about it afterward. I didn't yet know what I was going to do with it. I just knew I needed it to exist somewhere organized, the way I might chart a patient's vitals over time to see a trend line no single reading could show on its own. The 11th incident, in the fall of 2024, is when Tyler was diagnosed with stage 4 chronic kidney disease. The result, his nephrologist told the family plainly, of years of alcohol use combined with an underlying genetic predisposition none of us had known about before. I remember sitting in that first diagnostic appointment, in my professional capacity as much as my role as his sister, understanding immediately the severity of what we were looking at, and feeling underneath the fear for my brother's life, a complicated, guilty awareness that whatever came next was going to run through the exact same family machinery that had shaped every other crisis before it. I want to add one more incident here from Thanksgiving of 2020 because it shows how the pattern extended beyond just my parents into the wider family system around us. My Aunt Susan, my father's sister, hosted that year, and during a lull in the meal she turned to the table and said warmly, meaning it as praise, "Isn't it wonderful how Rachel's always been the one who just handles things and Tyler's the one we all get to worry about together?" Several relatives nodded along, laughing softly, treating the comment as an affectionate, harmless observation about 2 different but equally valid family roles. I remember smiling along with everyone else at that table, the way I'd smiled along with variations of that same sentence my entire life, while understanding with a clarity that surprised me even then that the one we all get to worry about together was, in its own quiet way, a description of belonging itself. Tyler's crises had become a shared family project, a thing that connected everyone at that table to one another, while my own steadiness had become, functionally, an absence, a non-event, something that connected me to no one because it never asked anything of anyone else. The 12th incident, and the last one I'll walk you through before we get to what happened this spring, occurred in January of this year at what would turn out to be the final ordinary family dinner before Tyler's diagnosis changed everything. My mother, discussing an upcoming milestone birthday of my own, my 35th, mentioned, almost as an aside, that she and my father were thinking of using some savings to help Tyler with a down payment on an apartment now that he's finally getting back on his feet again, roughly $9,000. I asked carefully whether there might be any similar gesture available for my own upcoming birthday, half joking, testing the water the way I sometimes did by then, more out of curiosity about the answer than real expectation. My mother laughed lightly and said, "Oh, Rachel, you don't need help the way he does. You've always had your feet under you." My father added, nodding along, "That's just how it's always worked out, honey. Some people need more support than others." I remember sitting there, 34 years old at the time, hearing my own father describe 18 years of documented financial asymmetry as though it were simply weather, something that had happened to our family rather than something they had actively decided, choice after choice, dollar after dollar. I smiled and let the comment pass, the way I had let hundreds of similar comments pass across 35 years, though I remember driving home that night, finally beginning to understand that "you've always had your feet under you" was not and had never been a compliment. It was simply the sentence my family used to describe the specific kind of child whose needs could be treated as permanently optional. I want to pause here because this is the point in the story where I need to name something explicitly, the way I've since learned to name it whenever I try to explain this to anyone who asks how it went on so long. That's the machinery of it. It was never really that my parents loved Tyler more than they loved me, not in any simple sense. It was that fear, once it attaches itself to one child early enough, in this case during 11 real frightening days in a neonatal unit in 1994, can calcify into a permanent operating system for an entire family. One where every subsequent crisis, however self-created, gets processed through the same emergency setting, while the other child's steadiness gets quietly reclassified, again and again, as evidence that she simply doesn't need the same kind of care. Over the following months, Tyler's kidney function continued to decline, and dialysis became a 3 times weekly reality for him by January of this year, 4-hour sessions that visibly wore him down more each week. I want to be honest that watching that decline, even before I knew what I would eventually find, was genuinely painful to witness, not as some abstract family obligation, but because he is still my brother, the boy I used to build blanket forts with before either of us understood anything about favoritism or fairness. I drove him to 2 of those dialysis sessions myself that January, sitting in the waiting room both times with a paperback I never actually managed to read a single page of, watching other patients' families come and go, noticing almost against my will, which families seemed to split caregiving duties evenly among their children and which ones, like ours, seemed to have quietly settled the question decades earlier. By March of this year, Tyler's kidney function had declined to the point where his medical team began discussing transplant options, and preliminary compatibility testing showed I was medically an excellent potential match, a 6 out of 6 antigen match, according to Dr. Patel, rare enough between siblings that it felt in that first conversation almost like a strange kind of relief, evidence that biology itself had handed our family an unusually clean solution to an otherwise devastating problem. I remember Dr. Patel explaining the match statistics to me in a separate call, professional to professional, and feeling for a brief window of maybe 2 days, something close to hope rather than dread about what was coming. That's when my mother sat across that consultation room table, took both my hands, and told me I was the only one who could save him, that I'd always been the strong one, that this was what I was built for. I told her I needed a week. The person I called first was Marcus, sitting in our kitchen that same night, and I told him everything, not just the transplant request itself, but the full weight of the spreadsheet, the $91,400, 18 years of you're capable of earning your own way, set against Tyler's every emergency being treated as a shared family emergency by default. Marcus listened for a long time without interrupting, then said, "Rachel, I will support whatever you decide about the surgery completely. But I need you to separate two questions before you decide anything. Do you want to do this because it's medically right and it's genuinely what you want to give your brother, or because you're afraid of what happens to your place in that family if you're the one who finally says no?" I didn't have an answer for him that night. I want to sit with that question a little longer because I think it's the part of this story that matters most, even more than what I eventually found in Tyler's chart. For the first 3 days of that week, I genuinely believed my hesitation was purely medical caution, the professional instinct to gather full information before consenting to any procedure on myself or anyone else. It was only on the fourth night, lying awake next to Marcus, that I let myself ask the harder version of his question honestly. If I said no to this surgery cleanly with no medical justification at all, simply because I didn't want to give up a kidney, would that no be allowed to stand in my family, or would it simply become one more piece of evidence that I had, after all these years, finally revealed myself as selfish, the exact accusation I had spent 35 years structuring my entire life around never earning? I thought about the shelf of photographs in my mother's living room, still mostly Tyler's even now. I thought about the couch I'd slept on in 2014, the wedding toast in 2018, the Saturday 4 days after my miscarriage. I understood somewhere around 2 in the morning that fourth night that I did not actually know with any real confidence whether my family's love for me had ever been separable from my usefulness to them, and that not knowing terrified me more than the surgery itself did. I want to be honest, too, about the specific fear underneath all of this because I think it's more universal than my own particular family's shape. It wasn't a fear of surgery or even, really, a fear of losing a kidney. It was the fear that if I stopped being the daughter who solved things without complaint, there would turn out to be nothing else underneath that role for my parents to actually love, that reliable and loved had been this whole time functionally the same word in that house, and that testing the difference between them might reveal there wasn't one. I thought during that same sleepless stretch about my grandmother Dorothy, gone 9 years by then, and the sentence she'd said to me at her kitchen table in Pueblo: "Loving 2 children the same and treating them the same were never the same thing." I understood, finally, at 2 in the morning, what she'd actually been trying to hand me all those years ago. She wasn't telling me my mother didn't love me. She was telling me, gently as early as she could, that love alone had never been the thing in question, and that I would eventually need to stop waiting for proof of love and start asking instead for proof of fairness, because only one of those two things could actually be measured, documented, and changed. I want to be honest that I still didn't fully have an answer to Marcus's question 3 days later either. When, going through Tyler's discharge paperwork as part of a professional courtesy his own hospital had extended me, given my position at a partner facility, I found the first thing that changed the shape of the question entirely. I want to spend real time on what I found because it's the actual gut punch of this story, and it didn't arrive the way I expected it to. Reviewing Tyler's most recent labs, cross-referenced against his own patient portal history, which he'd given me limited access to months earlier so I could help manage his medication schedule, I noticed an elevated liver enzyme panel from a routine blood draw taken just 11 days before that consultation room conversation with my mother, a marker inconsistent with the 6 months of confirmed sobriety his transplant eligibility had been built around. I sat very still at my own kitchen table looking at that single number for a long time. I didn't call anyone right away. I didn't confront Tyler right away either. I did what 13 years of ICU training had taught me to do with any anomalous reading. I looked for corroborating evidence before I trusted a single data point on its own. I remember thinking, almost clinically, the way I might approach any unexplained lab value on a patient chart: one abnormal number is a question, a pattern is an answer. I needed to know which one I was looking at before I let myself feel anything about it. Over the following 4 days, quietly, carefully, I found more. A text exchange, visible on a shared family group chat backup Tyler didn't realize was still syncing to an old tablet my mother used, between Tyler and a friend, dated 3 weeks earlier. That read, in part, "Just a couple, doesn't count if it's before the final pre-op labs, I'll be clean for the actual test." A voicemail left by my mother on Tyler's phone. That had been accidentally forwarded to my number due to a contact mix-up, in which she said, "Just get through the next testing window, honey, we'll figure the rest out after. Your sister will do this for you no matter what, she always does." I sat in my car outside the hospital after finding that voicemail engine off for nearly 20 minutes before I could make myself walk inside for my shift. I want to describe exactly what that discovery felt like from the inside because I think it matters more than any single fact within it. It wasn't rage, not at first. It was a very specific, very quiet kind of vertigo. The sensation of an entire architecture I'd spent 35 years standing inside of. One I'd assumed was built, however imperfectly, out of love and fear and a genuinely difficult medical history, revealing underneath a second, smaller structure that had simply been counting on my compliance being unconditional enough to survive being lied to. I called Marcus first from that same parking lot and read him the voicemail. He was quiet for a long moment, then said, "Rachel, I need you to hear this clearly because I don't think you're going to want to. This was never actually a medical decision they were asking you to make. It was a foregone conclusion they were managing around, and your consent was just a formality they assumed they already had." I sat with that sentence for a long time after we hung up, staring through the windshield at the hospital's loading dock, understanding slowly that I needed to walk inside in 11 minutes and start a 12-hour shift as though nothing had just cracked open underneath my entire adult life. I also spoke, that same week, with a hospital social worker I trusted, a woman named Denise Alvarez who specialized in transplant psychosocial evaluations, and had, in a professional capacity unrelated to my own family, walked dozens of living donors through exactly this kind of decision. I didn't identify Tyler by name in that conversation, framing it instead as a hypothetical professional question, though I think she understood gently that it wasn't hypothetical at all. She told me something I've turned over in my mind many times since. The psychological literature on this is very clear, Rachel. Coerced donation, even coercion that never uses a single unkind word, even coercion that looks from the outside exactly like love, correlates strongly with long-term resentment, depression, and family rupture, regardless of surgical outcome. The healthiest donors are the ones who arrive at yes on their own timeline, with full and accurate information, not the ones who are walked to yes by people managing the process around them. She asked me one more question before we ended the call. If your brother's sobriety claim turns out to be false, does that change anything for you? Medically or otherwise? I told her honestly that it changed almost everything, not because I loved him less, but because a kidney given to someone actively drinking, someone whose own team had explicitly built the surgical timeline around a 6-month sobriety window, wasn't actually the medically sound gift my family had been describing it as. It was a gift being extracted under a false premise, one that could genuinely endanger both Tyler's health and my own if the truth surfaced only after the surgery, not before it. I asked Denise, near the end of that call, a question that had been sitting underneath everything else all week. How often in her professional experience did families actually understand the harm in what they were doing, versus genuinely believing their own version of events even while quietly managing the facts around it? She was quiet for a moment, then said, "Honestly, Rachel, more often than you'd think, it's both at once. People can know on some level that they're bending the truth, and still fully believe they're doing it out of love, because the alternative, sitting with the possibility that their child might actually die because of his own choices, is unbearable to them in a way that makes almost any workaround feel justified in the moment." I've thought about that answer more than almost anything else anyone said to me that week, because it didn't let me hate my mother cleanly, and it didn't let me forgive her cleanly either. It just described, accurately, the messy human machinery underneath everything that had happened. I want to spend a little more time on the fear itself because I think it's the actual emotional core of this whole story, more than the confrontation that came after it. For nearly a week after finding that voicemail, I lay awake some nights running the same loop. If I stopped being the daughter who solved things, who absorbed cost after cost without complaint, who could always be counted on to show up with a spreadsheet, a couch, 2 weeks of paid time off, and now potentially an organ, would there be anything left of my place in that family at all? Would my parents see me as someone who had finally, after 35 years, drawn a boundary rooted in real medical and ethical concern? Or as someone who had simply been looking for an excuse the whole time to abandon her brother at the exact moment he needed her most? I thought during one of those sleepless nights about the 9-year-old version of myself lying in bed with a fresh cast on her arm, already absorbing, without words for it yet, the specific currency her body held in that house. I understood, lying awake at 35, that the surgery being asked of me now was, in its own devastating way, simply the largest, most literal version of a request I had been quietly granting in smaller forms my entire life. I also want to be honest about the part of me that, even knowing everything I now knew, still wanted to say yes. I loved my brother. I do love my brother, complicated as that love has become. I understood, sitting with Denise's question, that if his sobriety claim had been true, if the timeline had been honest, I likely would have gone through with the donation, and part of me still, even now, grieves the version of this story where that could have simply been true. What I could not do, once I knew what I knew, was participate in a surgical plan built on a falsified sobriety window, one that put both of our lives at meaningfully higher risk, simply because saying no, clearly and permanently this time, felt like the single most frightening sentence I had ever considered saying out loud to my own parents. I also began seeing a therapist that same week, a woman named Dr. Naomi Reyes, whom I'd actually been seeing on and off since the miscarriage in 2022, though I hadn't brought this specific situation to her yet. When I finally did, in an emergency session, she fit me in on short notice. She asked me a question that sat differently than either Marcus's or Denise's had. Rachel, if Tyler weren't sick at all right now, if this were simply a request for $91,000 more, would you be agonizing this much over saying no? I told her honestly, probably not, that the medical stakes made everything feel more binary, more urgent, harder to separate from actual love. She said, that's exactly the mechanism they're counting on, whether consciously or not. Illness doesn't change the underlying pattern of your family, it just raises the cost of finally naming it. I've returned to that sentence many times since because it helped me understand that the surgery itself was never really the core question. The core question, the one I'd been avoiding for 18 years in smaller, cheaper versions, was simply whether I was allowed to say no to my family at all, regardless of the size or urgency of what they were asking for. I decided, 6 days into the week I'd asked for, that I wasn't going to have a screaming confrontation at Tyler's bedside, and I wasn't going to quietly withdraw from the donation process without ever naming what I'd found either. I was going to do exactly what 13 years of critical care nursing had trained me to do: present the actual clinical picture, calmly, with sources, in a room with the people who needed to see it, and let the truth itself, rather than my own anger, be the thing that finally interrupted a pattern 18 years in the making. I requested a family meeting through Tyler's actual transplant coordination team, not just an informal conversation at my parents' kitchen table, specifically because I wanted the clinical seriousness of what I'd found to be evaluated by people with no emotional investment in managing the outcome. That meeting happened on a Thursday afternoon, 8 days after the original consultation room conversation, in a proper conference room at the transplant center, with Tyler, my parents, Tyler's transplant surgeon Dr. Patel, and Denise, the social worker, all present. I brought a single-page summary, prepared the way I'd prepare any clinical handoff: the elevated liver enzyme result, its date, its inconsistency with the required sobriety window, the corroborating text message printed with Tyler's own words visible, and the voicemail which I'd had transcribed rather than played aloud, out of some instinct toward preserving a small amount of dignity even in that room. I remember my hands were steady handing that page across the table, steadier than I expected them to be, though my heart was pounding hard enough that I could feel it in my ears. I said calmly, looking mostly at Dr. Patel rather than at my family, I want to be evaluated as a donor based on accurate information, and I don't believe the sobriety timeline underlying this surgical plan has been accurate for at least the last 3 weeks. Dr. Patel took the summary, read it in silence for close to 2 minutes, the only sound in the room the faint hum of the building's ventilation system, then looked up and said the transplant would need to be paused immediately pending a new toxicology screen, an outcome that medically was not optional once the information existed in front of him. My mother's voice cracked as she said, Rachel, how could you do this to your brother? He's fighting for his life and you're bringing paperwork into the room. And my father said louder, this isn't the time for whatever point you're trying to make. You can sort out your feelings later. Right now he needs you. I let both of them finish. I didn't raise my voice once. I said, I'm not trying to make a point. I'm trying to keep both of us alive through a surgery that was about to happen under false information. A kidney given to someone actively drinking isn't a gift, it's a second failure waiting to happen, and I refuse to let this family's need for a clean, simple story cost either of us our actual health. Tyler, who had been silent through most of this, staring at the table, finally spoke quietly and said, I didn't think it would matter, just a couple drinks. I was going to be clean for the real test. I swear I wasn't trying to hurt you. And I said gently the one clean line I think landed the whole point of everything that had happened, not just that week, but across 18 years. I know you weren't trying to hurt me, Tyler. I don't think you were even thinking about me at all. That's kind of the whole problem. The room was silent for a long moment after that. Dr. Patel, to his credit, was the one who eventually spoke, saying in a measured, professional tone that from a purely clinical standpoint, proceeding with any living donation under a falsified sobriety record would have exposed both the recipient and the donor to unacceptable and preventable risk, and that his team would have paused the process themselves within days regardless, once the new labs came back through routine preoperative screening. I remember something in me loosening slightly at that confirmation. A small, quiet relief that I hadn't simply invented a crisis out of my own exhaustion, that the facts, laid out plainly, held up under a stranger's clinical scrutiny exactly the way I'd trusted they would. Denise spoke next, gently addressing my parents directly rather than Tyler or me. She said, "I want to be clear with everyone in this room that what Rachel did today took real courage, and it also very likely protected both of your children's lives. I've seen family systems that couldn't tolerate this kind of honesty, and I've seen the outcomes when the truth surfaces after a surgery instead of before one. This is the better version of this conversation, even though I understand it doesn't feel that way right now." My father, who had been sitting rigidly with his arms crossed through most of the meeting, uncrossed them slowly at that, though he didn't say anything in response. My mother started crying then, not performative, I believe, but real, and said, quietly, almost to herself, "I just couldn't watch us lose him, not after everything I promised myself a long time ago I never would," and stopped there, unable to finish the sentence. I want to be honest that hearing that broke something open in me too. Some understanding that my mother's decades of protective urgency toward Tyler weren't born purely out of favoritism in some cold, calculating sense, but out of a fear planted in a neonatal unit 31 years earlier that she had never once learned how to set down. So she'd built an entire family's emotional and financial architecture around managing it instead. That didn't make the voicemail acceptable, it just made the whole picture sadder than a simple villain would have been. The aftermath wasn't clean, and I think it's important I tell you that honestly, because too many of these stories end with a neat bow on top and mine didn't. Tyler's new toxicology screen confirmed the elevated markers, and his transplant eligibility was formally paused per hospital protocol, pending a new 90-day verified sobriety period, this time monitored through random testing rather than self-report. I remained, medically, an eligible potential donor for whenever that window is legitimately completed, though I've told my family plainly that any future donation will happen only under a transparent, independently monitored process, not one managed informally around a kitchen table. Tyler has not spoken to me since that meeting, beyond one brief stiff phone call in April where he said only, "I hope you're happy," in a tone that made clear he still, even then, understood almost nothing about what had actually driven any of this. I told him calmly the same thing I'd told my parents weeks earlier. This was never about being happy. It was about both of us surviving something that couldn't be built on a lie. He didn't respond. The call ended a few seconds later. I've heard, secondhand through my mother, that he entered the new 90-day monitoring period seriously this time, attending meetings 4 times a week, though I've chosen not to reach out directly to confirm it myself, wanting, for the first time in my adult life, to let someone else's recovery be something I hear about rather than something I personally manage. My father, for his part, called me 2 weeks after that meeting and said, somewhat stiffly, that he understood why I'd done what I did medically speaking. A sentence that acknowledged the facts without quite reaching the deeper apology I think I actually needed to hear. I asked him directly on that same call whether he could recall a single time in my adult life he'd asked me how I was doing before asking what I could do for Tyler. There was a long silence on the line, long enough that I almost thought the call had dropped before he said quietly, "I don't think I can, Rachel. I don't know what to do with that." I told him he didn't need to know what to do with it that day. I just needed him to sit with it, the same way I'd been sitting with it for 35 years. My mother and I have spoken twice since then, both times brief, both times careful, neither time reaching anything close to the conversation I suspect we actually need to have eventually about 11 days in a neonatal unit in 1994, and everything that grew out of them in the 31 years since. The second of those 2 calls in early May, she said something that surprised me unprompted. "I think I've been so afraid of losing him that I forgot I could lose you too, just in a quieter way." I didn't have a response ready for that. I told her I appreciated her saying it and that I needed more than one sentence before I could trust it as something more than a moment of guilt passing through. She said she understood. I believe cautiously that she meant it. There is one small, genuinely redemptive thread I want to leave you with, though. Tyler's 10-year-old daughter, my niece Ava, has started asking her grandmother, according to something Tyler mentioned in an unguarded moment during that April phone call, why Aunt Rachel always helps everyone but nobody helps her back. I don't know what will come of that question in a 10-year-old's mind over the coming years, but I like knowing it's been asked, out loud in that family, by someone young enough to still expect the answer to make sense. I've started since that meeting making a point of showing up in Ava's life directly, on my own terms, not as the family's backup solution rooted through her father. And she's begun calling me some Saturdays just to talk. No crisis attached at all, which is, I've come to realize, one of the most unfamiliar and precious things anyone in that family has offered me in 35 years. 2 weeks ago, she asked me, with the same blunt clarity children sometimes manage better than adults, "Are you and Dad going to be okay?" I told her honestly that I didn't know yet, but that whatever happened between us, it would never change how much I loved having her as my niece. She seemed satisfied with that answer in the specific, uncomplicated way only a 10-year-old can be. Marcus and I are trying for another pregnancy this year, something I hadn't fully let myself think about seriously, until after everything with Tyler settled into its current unresolved shape. I mention it here because I think it matters. I want more than almost anything. For any child, we have to grow up in a family where love isn't measured out according to how much crisis a person generates, where steadiness is treated as a gift rather than an excuse to look away. I don't know yet whether my own parents will be capable of offering that to a grandchild any more successfully than they offered it to me. I know I intend to build it myself regardless, with or without their full participation. Dr. Patel, for his part, reached out to me directly about 6 weeks after that meeting, not about Tyler's case specifically, but to ask whether I'd be willing to speak anonymously to a hospital ethics committee reviewing the transplant center's informed consent protocols for living donors. I said yes. I spent an afternoon in May walking a room full of clinicians and administrators through exactly what had happened, without naming my family, focusing instead on the structural gap that had let a falsified sobriety claim nearly reach an operating room. The fact that family-reported timelines had been weighted too heavily against objective, randomized testing in the final weeks before surgery. The committee adopted a policy change that summer requiring an independent, randomized toxicology screen within 72 hours of any scheduled living donor transplant, regardless of prior reported sobriety length. I don't know that anyone on that committee will ever know it was my own family's near miss that prompted the change. I know it, and I've decided that's enough. Denise and I have stayed in touch as well, and she told me over coffee in June something that's stayed with me since. "You know, Rachel, most people I work with in your position never actually get the confirmation you got, that clean piece of paper proving the coercion was real and not just their own anxiety talking. Most people have to make this decision with nothing but their own gut feeling, and I want you to know that gut feeling would have been just as valid, even without the lab result." I've thought about that sentence often, because it reframes something I hadn't fully considered, that even if Tyler's sobriety claim had turned out to be true, my exhaustion, my fear, my need for a week before signing anything, would still have been a legitimate, sufficient reason on its own, not something that required a falsified lab result to justify. Alina, my childhood best friend, took me out for my actual 35th birthday in April, a small dinner with just the two of us, and toasted me with a sentence I've kept close ever since. "To the version of you that finally gets to be asked what she wants for dinner." It was a small joke, referencing the memory she'd shared with me months earlier about my mother never once asking, but it landed with real weight, and I found myself, for maybe the first time in my adult life, actually crying at my own birthday dinner, not out of sadness but out of something closer to relief. Dr. Reyes and I have continued our sessions, now weekly instead of occasional, working through what she's described as 35 years of learned hypervigilance around other people's needs. A phrase that landed uncomfortably accurate the first time she said it and has only grown more accurate with time. She told me recently that the goal of our work together isn't to make me stop caring about my family, but to help me learn to notice, in real time, the difference between genuine care and reflexive self-erasure, a distinction I'm still, honestly, learning to feel in my body rather than just understand intellectually. I visited my grandmother Dorothy's grave in Pueblo in late June, something I hadn't done in almost 2 years, driving the 2 hours alone on a Saturday morning with a coffee I didn't finish. I stood there for a while, telling her quietly out loud everything that had happened that spring: the consultation room, the voicemail, the meeting at the transplant center. I told her I finally understood what she'd meant at her kitchen table a decade earlier and that I was sorry it had taken me this long to act on it. I don't know if I believe in any literal sense that she could hear me. I know that saying it out loud, standing there in the Colorado sun, felt like closing a loop that had been open since I was 25 years old, and that felt like its own kind of necessary ending, regardless of what I do or don't believe about where she actually was to hear it. I think now about that voicemail, my mother's voice saying so certainly, "Your sister will do this for you no matter what, she always does." And I understand finally at 35 years old that being someone's whole solution was never the same thing as being someone's family. Being needed endlessly without ever once being checked on isn't love. It's just a very convincing imitation of it, one that can run for 18 years before anyone underneath finally asks to see the actual numbers. I think too about my grandmother Dorothy's sentence from that kitchen table in Pueblo, 10 years old in my memory now, but somehow more true with every year that passes. Loving two children the same and treating them the same were never the same thing. I don't know that my parents will ever fully close that gap at their age. After 31 years of a fear, they built an entire family's architecture around managing. I've decided I can hold real compassion for where that fear came from. A genuinely terrifying 11 days in a neonatal unit in 1994, while still refusing to let it be the reason my own life continues to be treated as the reliable backdrop against which my brother's crises get to matter more. Those two things I've learned can both be true at once. Compassion for where a pattern came from was never the same thing as permission for it to continue. I want to say one more thing before I close about what actually changed the shape of this story, because I think it's easy to hear she found a lie and confronted her family and assume the lie itself was the point. It wasn't, not really. The lie was simply the first piece of evidence specific enough, undeniable enough, that even 35 years of practiced deference couldn't quietly absorb it the way I'd absorbed everything before it. The actual point, the thing I hope stays with you longer than any single detail of my brother's diagnosis or my mother's voicemail, is this: you are allowed to ask for the week. You are allowed to look closely before you sign anything, hand over anything, or give anything, no matter how urgently, how lovingly, how reasonably someone frames the request. Urgency is not evidence. Love that only shows up as a request for your body, your money, or your time is not on its own proof that you are valued. Sometimes it's simply proof that you've been paying attention to everyone except yourself for so long that nobody thought to check whether you were too. If you've ever been told that your steadiness meant your needs could wait indefinitely, I want you to know that the exhaustion you felt wasn't weakness and it wasn't disloyalty. It was the first honest signal you'd gotten in a long time. Comment your own version of that consultation room moment below. Share this with someone who's spent their whole life being the strong one without anyone once asking what that strength was costing them. And subscribe if you want to hear the next one. Because there are more stories like this one, and I think a lot of you needed to hear tonight that calm, documented truth can interrupt even the oldest, most deeply rooted family pattern if you're finally willing to ask for the week you need before you sign anything at all.